as we kind of go through this very interesting case. A couple of things before we dive on in. Again, my name is Jenny Trulock. I am the programs manager here at the Homestead Museum. And I'm very glad that you are willing to join us during this Memorial Day weekend for this program. This program is a true crime case that we're going to be chatting about today, and the content might be a little uncomfortable for certain audiences, especially younger audiences, because we will be discussing some violent acts that took place. So now might be a good time to move to another space, or maybe distract little ones if you have anyone around you that this might not be appropriate for about the next 45 to 50 minutes or so. As Jennifer mentioned, this recording will be made available on the museum's website later in the week, so you can always kind of pick up where you left off. Big thank you to Jennifer, by the way, for monitoring the Q&A boxes and chat boxes. I would like our time together today to be as conversational as possible. So if at any time you have any questions, there's something that you're curious about, please feel free to type those in, and then she'll find a spot that she can ask that question for you. One last disclaimer before we get going is I'm not a lawyer. Nor am I a legal historian. I do have a degree in history, and I've always taken a real tremendous interest in legal history, especially as it pertains to women. But surprisingly enough, this case, actually, when I first learned about it, I didn't even know that a woman was involved. I had actually stumbled across this case when I was searching through the museum's collection for something completely different. And I happened upon this photograph, a photograph that you'll see a little later on in the presentation. And it was of this very kind of mousy looking gentleman kind of sitting in a chair with his hands folded. And he had this, I guess there's no other way to describe it, but like a bemused looking smile on his face. And for some reason that just kind of caught my attention. And when I looked at the description in the museum collection about what this photograph was, I knew it was a press photograph taken in October of 1921. But when I looked at the back of that photograph, there was a sentence there that I was really not expecting to see. It said, Arthur Burch facing trial for the murder of J. Belton Kennedy in Los Angeles. That's it. That's all it had. And I thought, well, this isn't what springs to mind when you think of somebody who's on trial for murder. So I had to dig. I had to see what I could find out about this particular case. Now, one of the struggles with researching, especially criminal cases in California from the 19th through the early part of the 20th century, is that the majority of the court transcripts don't exist anymore. A number of trial transcripts are gone. There was a fire that destroyed a number of transcripts. And also, in an effort to save space, what often happened in these older court cases is that they would just keep the complaint, kind of what is this case about, and the verdict. So any testimony and things that were taken during that time are gone. So for our purposes, what I needed to do was kind of go through the newspapers of the day. Now, where I was very lucky in researching this case was that this was a big case for the Los Angeles area. Actually, this case really took over the headlines. There were literally thousands of articles written about this particular issue. So it actually kind of surprises me that this hasn't actually been made into a film, the story behind this, or that at least a true crime podcast hasn't picked up on it. Especially because the people involved in this particular case do look like they're straight out of central casting. And the story is really more like a movie plot. So to kind of set the scene for what took place, the situation around this particular case is happening between 1921 and 1922. Now, this is a period of massive change, especially in terms of women. And one woman in particular is really going to become the focal point of our story today. Now, for those who might need a little refresher, in 1920, in August of 1920, women finally earned the right to vote across the United States. It became the constitutional amendment that women could not be prohibited from voting. Also, around the same time, there's a huge flux. We're coming from ending a war in 1918, World War I ends. We go through this major flu pandemic. There's some nice comparison there with what we're going on now. Thanks for joining me today. That people are kind of in this state of flux, and women are really expressing themselves in new ways. They are working outside of the home by the 1920s more often than they were at any other time in the past. They are also living independently. They're not staying with their parents until they get married. They're also delaying marriage quite a bit at this time. Divorce rates start to rise at the beginning of the 1920s. And there's this new idea of dating. Prior to the 1920s, especially after Prohibition is passed, the concept of dating is kind of a new thing. Usually families, especially in middle and upper class families, your parents were very involved with who you were spending time with, and especially who you were picking as a spouse. And this was going to be a major conflict, especially for younger people who had experienced all of this turmoil with the war, with the pandemic, and who are really kind of getting out there and expressing themselves. And there's a lot made up of also the intimate relationships that people are beginning to involve themselves in before marriage. Quite a few articles on struggle buggies and petting parties and what is this generation coming to. So as the younger audience, or the younger people in the world, I should say, are kind of expressing themselves in these kind of new and novel ways, society itself is really holding tight to these 19th century kind of proper Victorian ideals of what womanhood really is. And this kind of push and pull is really going to come to a head involving this case. In many ways, this case, unfortunately, isn't just about the murder of this young man, but it's also kind of putting the idea of the new woman on trial as well. And for many people, Madalynne Obenchain, who literally they dub in the press as the woman in the case, is the epitome of that, of this new woman kind of gone too far. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to take that as a no. Let's begin. All right. So on the morning of August 6th, 1921, Angelenos were waking up to see variations of this particular headline in their local papers: famous beauty grilled in LA broker's murder. Over the next 16 months, this story is going to dominate newspapers, not only up and down California's coast, but across the United States. And really nothing pushes it off the front page. Even the trial of the silent film actor Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle for the death of Virginia Rapé, or the murder of Hollywood director William Desmond Taylor in his home in LA 6 months later, wouldn't really take away the public's thirst for this particular story. So what happened? Well, our story actually begins the evening before, August 5th, 1921. Around 9 o'clock at night, a man by the name of George Deering was driving past this cabin. This cabin was located in Beverly Glen, just outside this kind of rural area, just outside of Beverly Hills. And he was driving on his way to work when suddenly a hysterically sobbing woman comes out into the road and is begging him to pull over and to help her injured friend. Well, that friend he found kind of lying on the steps of the cabin. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see the crime scene photograph that was published in the paper. And he realized that this friend was far more than injured. He was dead. John Belton Kennedy wasn't going to be saved. And that beautiful young damsel in distress who had ran out into the road was the soon-to-be infamous Madalynne Obenchain. When they realized that a doctor wouldn't do him any good, they actually went to neighbors to come and watch over the body while he drove Madalynne to the police station. And while they were at the station, she explained that that man, John Belton Kennedy, was actually her fiance, and that they were on their way to dinner at a place called the Brentwood Club. And they had decided to stop off at his little cabin to search for a lucky penny she had once hidden there. But since it was dark outside, no streetlights back then, Kennedy had decided to go to the car to get a light. And as he headed down these steps, Madalynne says that she heard a stranger's voice. This is kind of how they depicted the crime committed in the newspapers. So Madalynne is standing here. Kennedy is here. She hears some voices coming from where she believes is the bushes over to the side. And suddenly she heard a shot ring out. She heard Kennedy cry, "Good night, Madalynne." And suddenly a second shot was fired. She then says that she saw two rough men running off into the bush, and she fled in horror and flagged some help on the road. Now, the police would soon discover that the relationship between this engaged couple was not necessarily a happy one. As a matter of fact, over the next several days, a story is going to start unfolding that has, again, more in common with a film plot than it does in kind of your average love story. The LA Times actually wrote an editorial casting each of kind of the principals in the case as characters in a movie. But as the Times said, when the movie character walks off the screen and into real life, they make a sorry mess of things. So this is how they were described in that editorial. And this editorial actually took place just 13 days after the murder was committed. So all of the big block quotes that you see here, "a pretty face and a fickle heart," is how they described each of the people. Madalynne Donna Connor Obenchain, referred to in numerous articles, as I mentioned before, as the woman in the case. She is described by some as an ingenue and by others as a vamp. She's said to be a charming and captivating beauty. She's in her mid-20s at the time of the murder, and she herself was actually a very well-to-do, college-educated woman, but she was also a childless divorcee. And she also had interests in the occult. That lucky penny just kind of started off a whole series of things. She claimed that they went to the cabin to retrieve that lucky penny because during their journey that night from the beach to dinner, they came across a black cat. And so she wanted to get rid of some of that bad luck. Also, there's much made about her going to palm readers and having fortunes told. And it plays a little bit of a part of this mystic love that people start to believe. She is casting a spell over people. She also was infatuated with the notion of romantic love. Now, remember, before this, getting married and having families and stuff was more, for lack of a better word, I think for some women was more of an obligation, was what you were expected to do, rather than finding that one true love of your life. Love was nice if you could get it in marriage, but it didn't always come that way. But Madalynne loved love. She would often write poetry and kind of keep old love letters and things, which would all become a part of the trial against her. Now, many people believe that this combination of things, she's beautiful, she's captivating, she loves love, she's well-to-do, she's a divorcee, she doesn't have any kids. This is all going to make a very dangerous combination. This makes her a very dangerous woman. And the press would actually state that Cleopatra would have nothing on Obenchain. And a Times journalist, Harry Carr, wrote about her that she puts men gently aside when she tires of them, and they yield with a smile of pain. When she wants them again, they throw aside careers, freedom, everything in answer to her nod. Now, the next major person in our story is this gentleman here. And this is the photograph that I was telling you about that kind of piqued my interest in this whole thing. Here is Arthur Burch, the Don Quixote born 4 centuries too late, otherwise known as the Accomplice. Now, Arthur Burch was the son of a Methodist minister. He actually met Madalynne at Northwestern University way back in the teens, where he was actually a track star, believe it or not. And she was voted most beautiful co-ed. So they had some interactions with each other, though she stated that the two had never dated and that they were just good friends. Now, in letters and telegrams gathered by the police and journalists leading up to the trial, he would sometimes refer to Madalynne as goddess. And her pet name for him was Jeff. Now, just to give you a point of reference, you might want to Google this at some point if you're not familiar. This was in reference to a popular comic strip of the day called Mutt and Jeff. And Jeff was not a flattering pet name. Jeff was the kind of short, more rotund, non-attractive sidekick to Mutt. But that's what she called him. So when Arthur, who was living in Evanston, Illinois, hears that Madalynne was actually returning back to Illinois, returning back to the Evanston area, because she had yet another breakup with Belton Kennedy, he quickly kind of befriended her again. And he would take her grocery shopping and on car rides. And even when she got sick, Burch hired a nurse to come and take care of her. So he and she were pretty close during this time period in 1920 when she's living in Illinois. And this is going to become a problem, especially for Burch's wife, Allie. She ended up filing for divorce from Burch in November of 1920, citing abandonment of her and their young son. So when, not so surprisingly, Madalynne does return to Los Angeles again in early 1921, the correspondence between the two of them seems to kind of dwindle off. She then kind of takes up with Kennedy again. But in July of 1921, there is a fight between Madalynne and Kennedy. And Madalynne sends a telegram to Burch, which the prosecution is going to later make a really big deal out of. She says in the telegram, if possible, wish you could leave here for just 2 weeks. If there is any chance for this, wire me. Have been prostrated the last few days. I need you and your friend I had last summer, goddess. Now, this friend, the police assume, is a shotgun. Madalynne and Burch both testify in their trials that it was actually the nurse that Burch had gotten for Madalynne when she was sick back in Illinois. Burch, of course, wires back and says he will be leaving on Thursday or Friday. And then on July 24th, he arrives in Los Angeles. So this is about 2 weeks prior to the murder. Burch checks into the Russell Hotel and requests a room opposite the Laughlin building, where it just so happens Kennedy works. It also seems possible that Burch could see Kennedy's office through his hotel room window. So another person in this case that really captured the hearts and minds of the public was Ralph Obenchain, the former husband. To some, he was a knight in shining armor, Steady Ralph, as he's nicknamed in the press. To others, he's a human doormat. Ralph Obenchain was also a World War I veteran. He was a Chicago attorney at this time, and he was Madalynne's former husband. He had met Madalynne at Northwestern University as well, and he and Burch and Madalynne all kind of knew each other. Now, it seems that at about the start of 1914, so years before this case even takes place, Madalynne and Ralph were engaged to be married. But by the late summer of 1914, for reasons I'm not 100% sure of, they called it quits. But then in late 1914, Madalynne's father passes and Ralph comes to be at her side, and he actually helps to make the arrangements for her father's funeral. So they seem to kind of reconnect a little bit, but she then goes off to New York. She decides maybe she wants to be an actress. He goes to law school and they separate ways for a little while, and then he goes off to war. Now, it seems that in the late fall of 1918, Madalynne is living in Los Angeles. She's there visiting her mother and her half-sister. And it seems at this time that she's dating Kennedy. They seem to maybe have met sometime in 1917. And they've been dating for about the past year. Now, in the late fall of 1918, both Kennedy and Madalynne are hit by the influenza pandemic. And this is the pandemic that you probably hear the news referencing quite a bit right now, because it was the last major pandemic that we saw worldwide. When Madalynne tried to reach out to Kennedy during her illness, it seems that Kennedy's mother, especially, kind of prevented that from happening. She seems to not have really approved of Madalynne and wouldn't let phone calls take place between the two. But when Ralph hears that Madalynne is ill, he drops everything, leaves Chicago, he's just returned from war, leaves Chicago, goes to LA to be at her side and to nurse her back to health. And on January 1st, 1919, Madalynne and Ralph Obenchain get married in LA. And Madalynne is later quoted in the papers saying, "I was engaged to Kennedy, but ended up marrying Ralph. So she isn't even really certain about how this happened. And it seemed that she seemed to be dedicated to her marriage to Ralph for about 2 weeks. On her wedding day, Madalynne's mother says that Kennedy sent telegrams and made phone calls begging Madalynne to not marry Ralph. And she went through with it anyway, but they seem to have gotten back involved by mid-January of 1919. And by March of 1919, Madalynne, when she was on the stand, testified to the fact that she told Ralph that she was still in love with Kennedy. She felt it was her duty to kind of be square with him and to tell him up front how she was feeling. And Ralph, kind of hoping maybe she would get over Kennedy, knowing that they had this kind of off again, on again relationship, agreed to a trial separation and went back to Chicago. Now, the following February of 1920, Madalynne and Ralph's divorce is final, and he does actually agree to pay her $80 a month in alimony, which would be about the equivalent of $1,000 today. And he also testifies that he frequently sends her blank signed checks, which the press and the prosecution are going to make a big deal out of. So as soon as Ralph hears in Chicago that she's in trouble with the law, that she is being accused of murdering J. Belton Kennedy, he drops everything and heads out to LA. He actually ends up losing his job in Chicago because of it, but he is going to defend her in court. And throughout the trial, he is seen as kind of this man in a million. They actually made a movie during the course of the trial called A Man in a Million, starring Ralph Obenchain, but it seems that the theaters refused to show it. So as far as I know, it has never been seen. But if there's a copy out there, I would love to see that. So not everybody has such flattering views of Ralph. Some really see him as this human doormat. And the Times, the Los Angeles Times especially, kind of goes after him. In an editorial, they said that he lacked a little of the caveman spirit, and that perhaps he was actually partly to blame for the death of Kennedy because pretty wives who are not mothers are the object of amorous attack. Now, the last person who kind of makes up our principal cast here is J. Belton Kennedy himself. He has paid the penalty for his foolish passion. Now, John Belton Kennedy, the sometimes fiance, was only 28 at the time of his death. He was a pretty well-to-do insurance broker in Los Angeles, and he was also the only child of John D. Kennedy and his wife, Annie. He actually still lived with his parents at the time, and they seemed to be heavily involved in his life. And I mean, heavily involved in his life. His father stated to the press that I was his constant chum. We had always chummed together and I knew every phase of his life. Now that's an interesting statement because he seems to be a little bit of a man of mystery. The press interviewed friends, associates, other kind of old family friends to kind of get a picture of who J. Belton Kennedy was. And it didn't really seem to agree on any one particular description. On one side, some said he leaned towards the priesthood. On the other, they stated that he flitted from woman to woman. A mutual friend of Kennedy and Madalynne actually said that there was a mystery in his life. and that he seemed to live in fear of some enemy or enemies. A family friend described him as most effeminate. And as a child, he was more like a girl than a boy in his tastes. Kennedy himself described his feelings and how he felt about things in a letter to Madalynne. And he said, "I wander in the dark and cannot see the light. I know that it lives, but the darkness is smothering. If I can only lift the bleak mantle away up from my shoulders and step out into the glorious days." Strangely enough, though, this wasn't the first attack on Kennedy. About 4 years prior, before Madalynne and he had even gotten together, he was attacked by 2 men on the streets of LA. And when he was in the hospital, they interviewed him, and he claimed that he didn't know them nor the reason why they attacked him. But friends and associates said from that day on, he always carried a gun with him. Now, the Times kind of summed up this, their article on the principles of this case with the following statement. The Times says all these things without a desire to prejudice the case of any of the accused. They may be innocent of the crimes alleged, but it is a newspaper's privilege to fairly discuss the pros and cons of this case as it has developed. But as you'll see, the Times did far more than just discuss the case within its pages. They actually attempted to supply the theory for how the case was committed. So on August 7th, just 2 days after the crime was committed, the LA Times published this image in their local paper. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit there. So you can kind of see, again, in this drawing, that's supposed to be Madalynne. There's Kennedy. Now, 2 journalists from the Times, the day after the murders committed, go to the scene of the crime and begin investigating the crime scene themselves. So they're just walking all over it. And they happen upon, they said, 2 spent shotgun shell cartridges from a 12-gauge shotgun. One was here at first dot there that you see kind of by a shed or a garage. And the other one was about 30 feet away. And they also said, as they were kind of investigating around, that they came across this little side road here. And they noticed some unusual tire tracks. Now, one of the tire tracks, it seemed to have kind of a mismatched tire set. And one of the tire treads was kind of like this check pattern. And so they took a plaster cast of it. Now, Los Angeles at this time is still kind of in flux. We actually don't have any police training until a few years after, until 1924. So while they're kind of moving towards this idea of kind of becoming more professional, they're still a little ways off from really being able to do that. So it's interesting that the journalists decided to kind of pick up the evidence on their own. So they find these imprints, and then they decide to start knocking on doors. And they find a witness who will agree to testify that they saw a car parked on that spot on the night of the murder between 8:45 and 9 p.m. and that it had its lights dimmed, but they didn't see a driver in the car. So armed with this information, the 2 journalists then decide to check local garages. And they discover a tire tread matched a Dodge Roadster that was rented by Arthur Burch from the Parsons Garage in LA. So they take this information to the Los Angeles District Attorney, Thomas Woolwine at the time, and they present the information, and Woolwine takes it and decides, let's go after Burch. They were already holding Madalynne as a key eyewitness to the case. So they already had her there, so they needed to go find Burch. Well, on August 7th, Burch was traveling by train back to Chicago from LA 2 days after the murder. And they stopped the train in Las Vegas, where he's picked up and brought back to Los Angeles. So now having the two of them there, after days of questioning, it's then decided that Madalynne and Burch will be indicted for the murder of Kennedy. So before the case actually, the trials can get going, there's a series of kind of twists and turns that take place that kind of get weirder and weirder as we go along. At first, because it's believed that Burch and Madalynne are co-conspirators in this, they were going to put them on trial together. But this is later decided not to happen. In September of 1921, Burch and Madalynne split their defense, and the prosecution and judge agree to this because they're going for the death penalty. They're charging them with first-degree murder. And so they thought that they should at least be given the privilege of having separate trials. But the prosecution decides that the case against Burch is much stronger, so they are going to try him first. Now, Madalynne's attorneys are going to take that information about the fact that the case doesn't seem to be necessarily as strong against Madalynne, and they're going to try and get her bail. But this is denied because, again, being a first-degree murder case, the court didn't want to set a precedent of allowing bail for this type of offense. So she ends up sitting in the county jail until her trial will take place, which actually doesn't happen until the following year. Now, in order to kind of prepare the best defense for Madalynne, Ralph takes it one step further, and he retains a particular lawyer from Chicago, the guy that you see on your screen here, Charles Erbstein. Erbstein is a very colorful Chicago lawyer. Not only has he been known to defend different gangsters in Chicago at the time, but he also had defended 22 other women accused of murder in Chicago and got each and every one of them off. So this really ticks off Woolwine. Woolwine already is upset because you got these Chicago attorneys coming around, sticking their noses into LA's business. And in court, Woolwine brings up, remember that other Chicago attorney that we had here about 11 years ago by the name of Clarence Darrow, who tried to, defend the McNamara brothers for the Los Angeles Times bombing. So I don't cotton really to LA or Chicago lawyers coming in here. I chose cotton, I guess, because Woolwine was from the South. He was also known to be a very colorful attorney himself. He got into fistfights with other attorneys in court. He was known to have kind of a very volatile temper, and we'll see some of that kind of expressed throughout the case. Now, before Burch's trial is set to start on November 1st, his lawyers actually submit an affidavit from his father, from other lawyers, from his former wife, from friends that say he's mentally unbalanced. And so they have to hold a lunacy hearing before they can start the trial. And 4 doctors found him sane, while 3 others did not. So they decided to continue forth with the trial. Now, before the trial begins on November 22nd, there's one final twist to be had. On November 14th, 1921, Ralph is seen going to the county jail after just coming from City Hall. And he's reportedly carrying a marriage license in his pocket for himself and Madalynne. And he strides into the county jail. He has made an appointment to see Madalynne, and Burch happens to be in the hallway, and he's chatting with some press reporters. And one of the press reporters tells Burch, hey, I hear Ralph's gonna propose to Madalynne today. And they say that his face completely changed, and he bolted away from the reporters down the hall into the room where Ralph and Madalynne were sitting with kind of their heads together chatting. And he drops to Madalynne's feet. And he says, no, Madalynne, no, marry me, not him. And Burch is begging for Madalynne to marry him, and Madalynne is kind of sitting there unknowing what to do. And Obenchain, Ralph, is supposed to be standing in the corner with kind of his arms folded, kind of watching this scene take place. And the judge that is going to be hearing Burch's trial decides to step in and says, you know what? There aren't going to be any jail cell marriages here. So your guys are going to have to wait. So he kind of puts off any possible marriage between anyone at that time. So finally, the case between Burch begins on November 22nd, 1921, and it will go until January 16th of 1922. Now there's over about 140 pieces of evidence that are brought before the court that I'm not going to go through all of that. It kind of all comes down to a few main points, which I'll try to give you kind of also the defense's statements about as well. So the first piece of evidence kind of brought against Burch at this trial was the telegram asking him to come to Los Angeles. Now his defense claims that he was actually already planning to come to LA. He had a job interview. And so it wasn't unusual for him to, you know, come and visit with Madalynne while he was in LA. The prosecution, though, digs up a porter from the train that Burch was on from Chicago to Los Angeles. And this porter testifies on the stand that they saw in Burch's compartment a yellow leather shotgun case. And so this obviously meant that Burch was carrying this weapon from Chicago to LA to take care of Kennedy. The defense finds people who rode the train, 2 women and a young girl, who all testify that they never saw Burch with any shotgun case, yellow leather shotgun case, or any case carrying any weapon at all. Next, they go to the clerk at the Russell Hotel. And when Burch checked into the hotel, again, remember that's 2 weeks prior to Kennedy's death, the clerk testified that he did ask specifically for a room facing the Laughlin building, and that when they went into the room to see if it met his satisfaction, he first went to the window to kind of take a look at the view. He also, Burch asks the clerk if it's okay for his female cousin to come and visit, which kind of seems weird by our standards today, to ask the hotel clerk if you can have visitors. Again, this is the beginning of the 1920s. Those Victorian ideals are still around, and the idea of having a young woman in someone's room, you know, especially in an upstanding hotel, wouldn't necessarily want that. So the clerk and Burch agree that he can have his cousin come to visit as long as he keeps the door open. The clerk also testifies that during the course of Burch's stay from July 24th to August 7th, he sees this female cousin, who he later identifies as Madalynne, come to the hotel about 4 or 5 times. Now there's also a nosy chambermaid that they put on the stand. And she says that while peeping through keyholes to see if rooms were unoccupied to clean them, she would often see Burch sitting in a chair at his window, just staring out at perhaps the office building across the way. Now, on the day of the murder, August 5th, 1921, the clerk testifies that his cousin called and left a message. And when Burch received the message, he left the hotel and stayed away until about 7:30 at night. He then returns to his hotel room for about 10 minutes. And when he comes back downstairs, the clerk testifies that he has seen him carrying a newspaper wrapped package. And he gives the dimensions, and he says in his case, in his personal opinion, he believes it might be a taken down shotgun. Seems like a pretty big leap, but okay. Then the prosecution takes an employee from the Parsons Brothers garage where Burch had rented a car from and said that on the night of the murder, Burch rented the Dodge Roadster, that he returned it back at the garage. He rented it about 7:45, 8 o'clock at night, and he returned it around 11:05 that evening. And they testified that he drove the car for 44 miles round trip. Now, it is the prosecution's opinion that that is the exact mileage to drive from the garage to the cabin where Kennedy was killed, to a beach to dispose of the shotgun, because the shotgun was never found in connection with the crime, and then to drive it back to the garage. So the last nail, as it were, in the prosecution's case against Burch was the fact that when he was arrested and taken off the train in Las Vegas and brought to the county jail in LA, he complained of a sore knee. And he was in a holding cell with another potential inmate who also happened to be a doctor. I don't know the circumstances around why that doctor was in the jail cell with him, but that doctor testified to removing a thorn from Burch's knee. And that thorn was supposed to match the plant life that was around Kennedy's cabin. So, armed with all this information, how do you think the jury decided in Burch's case? Jennifer's going to put up a poll for you right now, and we'll see if you guys vote the same way that the jury did in 1922. Or excuse me, yeah, 22. So we'll give it just a couple of minutes just to see, not actually minutes, a few seconds maybe. So you might see that up now. Also, if anyone has any questions, you can.
All right, so we've got our answers are starting to roll in. I'm going to give it just another minute.
Okay.
Ooh, it is very evenly split right now.
Oh.
All right, so any last answers, go ahead and send those in. Okay, but I think I'm going to go ahead and end the poll there. So very interesting. What we've got is 40% of our audience members say he is guilty, of course.
Okay.
8% say he is innocent, a victim of circumstances.
Okay.
No one thought he should be found insane, but many people thought that he might be guilty, but there's too much reasonable doubt to convict. So that was the largest group at 52%.
Wow, okay. Well, it was a hung jury. You guys did kind of find similar, in similar fashion to what that first jury did. It was deadlocked for 72 hours. The judge really tried to push for them to come to some sort of conclusion, but it seemed that they could never really move past a 10-2 vote in terms of him being found guilty. So it was 10-2 in favor of conviction. The two holdouts, it was later revealed, one thought that he was insane, you know, because obviously why would he be doing all this? You know, his family thinks he's insane, so, you know, he shouldn't be tried for this. And the second one felt that there just wasn't enough. And Woolwine, the DA of Los Angeles at this time, blows his top at this. He's railing against this woman in the press. That's also something I should note. It was the majority women on this particular jury. And this is actually kind of a newer thing too, because in Los Angeles, women had only been serving on juries since 1917. Majority of women don't get the right to serve on juries until way later. I'm talking like the 1940s, 1950s, in most parts of the United States. Some go all the way through the early 80s, sadly enough. But women go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask a clarification question when you get a second.
Sure.
So someone was asking, where was the Russell Hotel in relation to Beverly Glen?
It was a bit of a drive. The Russell Hotel is in downtown LA, where this particular hotel was. So it was a drive. This was something that ideally the 44 miles that Burch put on the car, because the prosecution did track that. So they added those extra miles saying, oh yeah, he must have driven to the beach. So if he just drove from the garage, which was walking distance from the hotel, to the Glen and back, it wouldn't have made sense on the mileage on the odometer on the car. So they had to kind of justify those additional miles.
Great. Do you have, is now a good time to ask you just a couple of other questions, or do you want to hold on to those?
Go ahead.
Okay. So somebody had asked about the doctor. Did the doctor who removed the thorns surrender it for comparison to the plants near the cabin, or how did they end up with that?
Because, you know, you have a jailer that's kind of watching the interactions between the two. So they take that because it is a piece of evidence. They don't know, and so it is compared, but also it's determined, the defense's view on this is that this is scrub brush. This grows all over the place in Southern California. You can't say it definitively came from this plant that grew next to his cabin. So that was kind of the defense's view on things. It's like, it could have happened anytime during that 2 weeks he was here.
Okay, great. And did Burch say where he claimed he went with the car that night?
No, they actually didn't have him testify, which isn't uncommon, actually. You know, most of the time in murder cases, the person accused of murder doesn't testify. It's in some rarer circumstances that actually happens. And the reason being because it's not always to the defense's best interests to do that, because all the defense has to do is create that reasonable doubt in the mind of the jury. So they don't have to prove anything. They don't have to tell you where he went. You know, as far as we know, he could have been going to a speakeasy. He could have done something else illegal during that time. So they don't want to incriminate him or paint him in any kind of bad light. So they just didn't address it. They basically said, well, where's the shotgun? You went searching for beaches. What beach? You tell us. That's the job of the prosecution.
Okay, and one more follow. Oh, I've got them popping up all over the place. Okay,
Oh, that's great.
So the shotgun. So Kennedy was actually shot with a shotgun.
You know, they didn't give a caliber on his death certificate. They didn't give a caliber or anything like that. He was shot in the neck. So I don't know if they could determine at that time if they knew what kind of weapon it was. They're really relying on the discovery of the journalists at this time in this very kind of rural area where it's not unheard of people going hunting at this time, maybe hunting for birds or whatever. So those shotgun shells, it is presumed as the person was fleeing, they ejected those shells. But again, no definitive proof that that was the caliber of weapon or the type of weapon that killed Kennedy.
Okay, I'm going to ask you two more quick questions, and then
No
I'll let you move along. Being that Burch was married, did his wife attend the trial?
She did come out during the lunacy trial. She came out because she was one of those that signed the affidavit saying that Burch was insane. Along with his father. His father came out, the Methodist minister came out as well to kind of find his son guilty of insanity. I guess they just really weren't sure. I mean, look at the picture. Does that guy look like he's worried about a first-degree murder trial? I don't know.
So true. Okay, and then one last question. So when Burch answered her letter about coming to California, did he make mention of the friend, quote unquote, that Madalynne inquired about?
No, he didn't. The response telegram that the prosecution had just said, leaving Thursday or Friday, all love, Arthur. So, okay. No, and, you know, who knows? He didn't travel with a nurse, so who knows?
All right, great. Well, thank you, Jenny.
No problem. All right, so DA Woolwine is incensed at this point. He goes after this particular juror who he claims he watched during the trial, and she only scribbled down the things that the defense said and ignored everything that the prosecution said. And he also stated that she went on the jury with her mind made up and refused to change it. So Woolwine was not going to give up. So instead of releasing Burch, he says, all right, let's go again. Because it is a hung jury, they can try him again. And the very next day, a new trial date is set. But before Burch gets his second trial, they have to address Madalynne's first trial, which finally takes place on February 6th, 1922. Now, Madalynne's trial, they're going to take a different tact with. During the jury selection for her trial, the prosecuting deputy DAs, Asa Keyes and Charles Frick, asked potential male jurors this question that you see on your screen: are you vamp-proof? And they were very serious about this. They made much about her ability to kind of manipulate men and also inspire loyalty from both genders, actually. And newspapers start hiring character analysts that read faces to kind of get a better understanding of the type of woman that she is. And this photograph of these hypnotic eyes was one that was printed in one of the local papers, and it asked, you know, are these the eyes of a killer? So they made quite a bit about the shape of her face, her aura. They brought in aura readers who read the aura of everybody in the courtroom. As I mentioned, she was a big believer in psychics and things like that. During testimony, she talked about how she and Kennedy would sometimes go visit palm readers and things. But there was a general interest in the occult still at this time, or this kind of ideas. So it wasn't unheard of for people to do this, but this was definitely something of a younger generation. So older people looking at this might think, well, she's a little unhinged. The biggest amount of evidence that the prosecution brings against Madalynne are her letters to Kennedy. Also her own diary entries. Her journals are brought in, and which it kind of details this very tumultuous on again, off again relationship. But the bigger sticking point, the biggest cause of their on again, off again, at least it appears in Madalynne's opinion, is his mother. The fact that his family wanted him to do nothing with a divorcee. You know, they didn't care how much in love she was with him. Actually, Kennedy's father, who went to every single day of the trials of Burch and Madalynne, would tell journalists that she pursued his son relentlessly. Now, that doesn't always seem the case in some of the letters that are brought by the defense as well as the prosecution, or the fact that Kennedy had actually kept so many letters. He kept them in a safe deposit box and also hidden in parts of his room at his parents' house. So there was some reason maybe he kept these things, but that's really going to make up the bulk of the case against Madalynne. And also Frick's opening statements, or excuse me, closing statement against Madalynne, in which he says, "I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, Madalynne Obenchain has no regard for the lover affections, respect, or anything else of any man. Her only use for that man is what she can get out of him and the way she can use him and make him do things. And I am at this time, as I have always felt from this evidence, that this is the type of woman we are dealing with here, having men at her beck and call to do what she wanted done." Now, the biggest issue for Madalynne's case is that there is no evidence of a plot. They again bring in the Russell Hotel clerk testifying that, yeah, he did, you know, every time she came over, he would kind of walk by Burch's hotel room to make sure nothing was going on, that the door was kept open, and it was. He never testified to overhearing any conversation between the two about plotting to kill Kennedy. So there was no direct evidence tying Madalynne to any plot or anything to really kind of make this kind of make sense for why she would have wanted Kennedy dead, other than the fact that, again, this is a woman scorned. He wouldn't marry her. He broke engagements all the time. She got fed up and she decided he didn't deserve to live anymore. But that's the type of woman that she is. So her trial finally ends on March 20th, 1922. And guess what? The jury is deadlocked again, 9-3 in favor of conviction. And Woolwine is like a bulldog. He is not going to give up. So then there are 3 more trials. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of those. But Burch has a second trial beginning in April, ends in May. Again, the jury is deadlocked, this time 7-5 in favor of acquittal. So tide is turning a little bit at this point. Madalynne's second trial begins in June, runs through August 2nd. So it ends just as we're kind of nearing the year after Kennedy's death. Her second trial had some interesting points pop up in it that weren't addressed at the first trial. The first kind of interesting piece was this gentleman, well, I don't know if gentleman's the right term for him. This guy, Paul Roman, takes the stand. And Roman was actually serving a 10-year sentence in Folsom Prison for larceny. And he testified that he met Madalynne while the two were being held at the county jail. And they started a relationship. And he stated on the stand that she wanted him to testify on her behalf, saying that he had overheard two rough men on the street one day plotting to kill Kennedy. And so he decided to go to DA Woolwine and give him this information in hopes that he would get a reduced sentence. He also turned over all the correspondence between himself and Madalynne. And to give you an idea of what these two were like, in Madalynne's letter to Paul Roman, she writes, "Tonight I have a little pale pink rose near me. The rose will be your lips, dear Paul, forever the romantic." And Paul wrote back, "What you need is a lot of attention, and I'm the guy to give it to you." So that gives you an idea of what they were like. Another kind of interesting piece to this ever puzzling trial was that there was a new person who came to testify on Madalynne's behalf. It was a woman by the name of Mrs. W.A. Osgood. She was a costumer, and she testified that Paul Roman and Kennedy were actually friends, and that they would come into her shop to rent women's clothing to wear to parties. And she stated that just before Madalynne had actually returned to Los Angeles and picked up with Kennedy again back in around July of, or June of 1921, that she had heard an argument between Kennedy and Roman, where Roman threatened to beat Kennedy up if ever he got married. So when Madalynne's trial ended on August 2nd, 1922, again, the jury was deadlocked. The judge tried to push for a decision, kept the jury together for 4 days, but it never got past an 8-4 vote to acquit. Burch's third trial took place in October through November of 1922. Same evidence again, and again, the jury is at an impasse, 7-5, again in favor of acquittal. So Woolwine finally throws in the towel. After 16 months and 5 separate trials, costing the county over $37,000, which today would be the equivalent of over $500,000, Burch and Obenchain are released. The charges are dropped and they're set free, and the police, believing that they had actually caught the two responsible but just weren't able to secure a conviction, never looked at anyone else as a suspect. So that came the end of the investigation of the death of J. Belton Kennedy. But the story of the principals kind of continued. So when Madalynne was released, the press asked her what was she going to do next. And she claimed that she was going to go to the South Seas and work in a leper colony. Turns out she moved to Eagle Rock, California. Paul Roman was eventually released from Folsom Prison in the mid-1920s and found out where Madalynne lived. And he was found often hanging around her property, either pledging his love for her or threatening her. And so he ended up going back to jail. He was in and out of jail pretty much the rest of his life. In 1926, Arthur Burch actually remarried again, not to Madalynne. He actually never stated who he married or where he got married. In October of 1926, Madalynne is asked by the Times, of all papers, who did not paint her in a very flattering light throughout the trial, or trials, I should say. They asked her to write an editorial opinion on another famous female case, the trial of Amy Semple McPherson, who had alleged she was kidnapped. She was a very prominent evangelical minister in Los Angeles at the Foursquare Church. And in the article that Madalynne wrote about this case, my impressions of Mrs. McPherson's trial. She didn't really talk too much about the evidence against Aimee Semple McPherson, but just wrote more about how she hopes that she can get a fair trial. One of the sadder points to this story happened in 1927. Arthur Burch was back in Illinois, in Chicago, working at a fire extinguisher company. And one day when he was entering the building, John D. Kennedy, Belton's father, was walking into the building at the same time, and he saw Burch and attacked him. Charges were filed, but he just paid a fine, and unfortunately he passed away. Kennedy's father passed away just a few years later. Another person who kind of was gone too soon was Ralph Obenchain. He actually passed away in September of 1939 at the age of 49. He did, though, have a bit of happiness in his life. He remarried in 1924, so just a couple years after the cases had ended, and he had children. He even once, in his obituary, they stated that in 1923, he saved a man from drowning in Lake Michigan. So I guess he was ever that steady Ralph and that knight errant. And then lastly, when Burch passed away, he was living in Pasadena at the time in July of 1944. He had, his last will and testament hadn't been updated since 1930. And he left his entire estate to his lifelong friend, Madalynne. Now, the estate didn't consist of much, really only worth about $1,400. And she actually refused the inheritance and said that it should go to his son. And from that point on, actually, I couldn't find anything else on Madalynne Obenchain. It seems that maybe she started going by her maiden name, Madalynne Connor. As far as I know, she never remarried. She didn't have children, but I don't really know what happened to her after 1944. But that takes us to the end of our story. So if anyone has any questions, now is a great time.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you for everybody who has been listening. And I do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So someone asked, was an autopsy ever performed?
Well, the coroner, there was a coroner's report. They didn't do well, whenever there's a murder trial or the idea that there is a murder, there is an autopsy. And again, they stated cause of death was homicide due to bullet wound to the neck.
Okay, great. And then another question. So did this case end up hurting the career of the DA?
Well, actually, Woolwine is a very interesting attorney. As I mentioned, he was a bit of a firebrand. It didn't really hurt him because also he is dealing with other grand, big trials, trying to discover who murdered the Hollywood director. But by the time that this case is over with, his health isn't too good. And he actually steps down in 1923. But he's really credited with kind of cleaning up Los Angeles. And one of the kind of surprising things is the person who takes over as DA is Asa Keys, who also was the prosecuting attorney of Madalynne. And Asa Keys was a shady attorney. He was later found guilty of taking bribes in the Julian Petroleum scandal in late 1920s Los Angeles. Woolwine actually only lived about 2 years after this trial ended. He died in 1924.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, someone has asked, could you please just re-summarize the story about the lucky penny? They said they didn't quite catch that.
Oh, okay. So Madalynne told the police that the reason that they had stopped off at the cabin in the Glen was because they she and Kennedy were on their way to have dinner at the Belmont Hotel, and they had driven from the beach that day. But during their day at the beach, they came across a bad omen, a black cat. And so she wanted to find this lucky penny that she knew she had hidden up at the cabin about a year before. And because it was dark, they couldn't really find the penny at first. He went to go get a light, and that's when the shots rang out.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Okay, we've had a couple of comments about shotguns and about how they work. So just reading them very briefly, somebody has pointed out that a bullet isn't a shotgun. And then also, let me just pull this up. When you shoot a shotgun, it will eject the shell each time you chamber a round, or they stay in the gun. A side-by-side or over-under shotgun would have ejected 2 rounds at a time. Neither makes sense that they would be along the road and so far apart. If it was a pump shotgun, it would have ejected the shells next to the stairs. So just pointing out some, you know.
Absolutely. Some inconsistencies in the theory about the case of how it was committed.
All right. Also, someone wants to know who was the owner of the cabin?
Actually, it was a birthday gift to J. Belton Kennedy from his parents. So Belton was the owner of the cabin.
All right. And then we've also got a question. How much do you think, or how much of the newspapers of LA were influenced by the Murders Row of Chicago?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, you know, it's funny because you have this, you have kind of this push-pull, this kind of, again, as police are starting to kind of professionalize more, journalists are too. And so you have this push-pull against what is investigative journalism versus what is sensational journalism. And, you know, everybody needs to sell papers. And really the 2 largest papers at the time in LA, the Times and the Herald, took very different viewpoints on this. The Times were the ones that were going out and investigating. They were trying to prove that they were doing real journalism, that this isn't just sensationalized. But, you know, the whole world at this time is kind of taken up with the doings of Chicago and gangsters. And, you know, it seems like the whole world is just on fire. And so I think maybe that did have some influence in regards to letting people like Madalynne kind of get away with murder. People were not willing to allow that to happen.
Fantastic. All right, we've got an opinion from Ruth. So she said, so for sure they did it. They got away with it because no evidence, right? So an opinion there. And then also from Mary Lou has said, Jenny, thank you very much. Very interesting. You are a great storyteller. Are you going to be having any more of these true crime cases on Zoom or on Facebook?
We are actually. Let's go to my last slide here. We have lots of different topics coming up. The next one on female justice, I actually won't be giving. The director, Paul Spitzeri, will be giving that one on the disappearance of Ida Hillis Addis. This case is a fantastic case. One of a very strong woman. She was kind of on track to become one of the greatest California writers when her entire story kind of gets cut short. And after a series of legal troubles of varying circumstances, everything from her being sued for seduction and alienation of affection, to suing her husband for abuse, to her being put on trial for attempted murder, she disappeared in 1901. So Paul will be delving into that case, and it is quite the case. So that will be on Zoom on June 7th.
All right, wonderful. So I think that's going to take us to the end of our questions. Once again, everyone, we are very grateful that you joined us today for our female justice case. And as you can see on the slide, we do have quite a few other events that are coming up. So Jenny talked about our next female justice, which will be happening Sunday, June 7th. That's the disappearance of Ida Hillis Addis. But we have some other programs as well that we would love to see you at. So all of these programs listed here are going to be virtual programs, and you can join us just the same way that you have today. So that will include coming up first on Saturday, May 30th, we are doing a genealogy basics workshop. So going over the basics of how you start putting together your family history. On Saturday, June 13th, we will be doing a paper preservation workshop. So that's going to be with our collections coordinator. She's going to be talking all about how you take care of, precious family items, things that you have in your house. Maybe you've been going through closets while you've been cooped up at home. So it's a great way to learn how to take care of those items. We will also on Wednesday, June 17th, have our next fiction book club meeting. We're doing a summer monster series. So we'll be reading a book called Led to the Slaughter, and it is about the Donner Party and werewolves. On Sunday, June 21st, we will have ragtime, jazz, and swing, which is early 20th century dance. So come and learn all about that. And then on Sunday, June 28th, a special guest will be talking about Black leaders of leisure in the American West in the struggle for freedom during the Jim Crow era. So she's going to be talking all about basically leisure sites around Southern California that were used primarily by African Americans during the Jim Crow era. So it should be great. All right, so thank you again, everyone. I'm going to stay on for just a couple of minutes to answer any lingering questions, but we hope that we will see you again soon. Any of these events that you see on this page, you can sign up if you go to our website. So that is homesteadmuseum.org. If you want to send us a message or reply to anything that we've sent to you, we'll also help you get signed up that way. All right, so thank you again and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. And if anyone wants to continue the conversation, also, please feel free to email me. We can chat more about it. I love talking about this stuff. So my email address is there, g.trulock, T-R-U-E-L-O-C-K, @homesteadmuseum.org. And be sure to follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Homestead Museum. So look forward to having you guys at more of these programs. Thank you again so much and have a really good afternoon. Bye.
All right, thanks everyone.